The wooden frame collided with the river and my forehead slammed against the slats. I spat salt and water and tasted mud. Betrayal lodged in my throat the moment Cage shoved the cage forward and did not turn back. Betrayal pushed my hands to the slats before the knots set. I counted the first swell with a finger loud in my own head. The chain clicked against the stake and the tide began to work the cage outward while a young jailer tightened the final knot and walked away. I say betrayal because I had expected pleading, not deliberate timing. I had expected someone, my name spoken into a Lord Seer, a prayer tied to my rope, a hand to stop the guard, but Otsu had already spoken the price. I was sold to pay a lord's debt. I learned that while my face was wet and my wrists burned, and that knowledge shaped every choice I would make in the next hours. The concrete problem was clear in the first breaths. The tide would rise on a schedule the keepers controlled, and they had engineered the schedule to make the endurance last. My name matters here even though I do not write it as a petition. I am a Kyo. I am thin enough that the hemp kimono hangs loose, and the salt has bleached the indigo until it looks like ash. My prayer beads are frayed, one strand already stripped away by Otsu's rough thumb. The pocket watch in my belt is dented. The cracked face presses cold into my side. I press that watch between two slats and vow, in the small place fury will let me hold, to mark what they do. The first night brings small defeats and a single motion meant to shame me. A fisherman I once knew slides a folded scrap of paper through the slats. Akio, he says, and his voice is clipped against the river wind. I told them I would speak. He does not meet my eyes. He pulls his cloak over his shoulders and walks back to the shallows. His name is Taro. His hands still smell of the nets he mends. Taro's refusal to stay is the first action that makes the betrayal real. I open the scrap with shaking hands. It is not a plea written for me to read aloud. It is a face-down coin and a note that says only, "We have no power here." The coin drops and rolls along my palm. The metal is cold as the water. That small exchange happens while the river nicks at the underside of the cage, and I press my forehead to the slats to listen to the current. I say nothing. I could not say anything that would change the coin's weight. Later, when the tide draws back a little, Otsu comes and stands over me like a judge who's forgotten mercy. Otsu, I murmur when I can make the word hold. He drags a prayer bead across my wrist and strips a single frayed bead as if that were penance. He hums a syllable of indifference and then says, "This was not punishment for theft, Akio. This was payment." The bead slips from his fingers and drops into the water where I cannot reach it. They speak in measured tones. Otsu's face is tight and plain, his hair pulled back in the keeper's knot, his breath cold with tobacco. He calls the procedure lawful. He does not call it cruelty. He calls it accounting. His voice is small and flat against the river's motion, and I am forced to convert that flatness into an image. My body is a ledger entry. Betrayal curves into contempt when he leans, looks me in the eyes and names the debt. Cage argues with Otsu at dawn while the first storm clouds bludgeon the horizon. "Let him go," Cage says, voice sharp enough that the rope creaks where it binds my wrists. "Set him loose." It's quicker. Cage's hands are raw from hauling cages. His jaw tightens when he looks at me. Otsu answers, faster fools the crowd. "The Lord wants a draw." "Keep him until the tide tells us to stop." Around them, the priestess Hana stands with tolly beads and a slate. She does not move her lips but counts by tapping a small stone against her palm. The argument runs like a current around me. Their choices are not mine, but they shape my breath. I test the slats by pounding my fists. The hemp rope bites the skin until my wrists split and salt bleeds into the wound. "Cage," I shout, when breath and pain can form speech, "if you leave me fast." I live. Cage does not answer my plea with promises. He says my name and looks away. "Akio," he says, "they will kill me if I steal you now." His voice breaks into a pause where fear sits like a stone. That exchange is the first emotion shift. Betrayal to anger to bargaining. I try to make the bargain physical. I use the edge of my cracked watch to scrape at the rusted ring that holds the chain. The watch cuts the pad of my thumb. I taste metal. Each scrape produces a metallic shriek that the river swallows. The guard who tightened the knot, cage does not come to stop me. He watches from the bank as if with distance he can keep himself safe. When I find the watch wedged between two slats, the glass is full of grit and the hands are stopped at noon. I press my finger to the hands and feel the deadness of the mechanism. Later, under dawn light, Cage passes close enough that I hear him say, quieter than the river, "They stopped your watch on purpose." They time the death. He spits the words out as though they are spittle. That revelation turns the suffering from misfortune into planned cruelty. The second emotion shift, confusion to terror. The day breaks into wind and rain. The river climbs and falls in chess moves the keepers make from the bank. A storm flings the cage, and I hang on until the wood bites into my shoulder. The priestess Hannah crouches and counts again with her slate. "Hannah," I whisper, "why do you count me like a harvest?" She does not look at me. "Hannah," I say louder, and she finally meets my eyes, slow and uncaring. "They paid." I tally her mouth a flat line. Her fingers keep moving. Outside, fishermen and villagers gather at a distance. Some come to stare. Some come to place bets. One boy lifts a clay cup and drinks, as if to toast the spectacle. The crowd's attention changes how the keepers act. Otsu paces and tempers his voice, because the Lord's favor is being recorded. When I call out, asking if anyone remembered my mother's name, no one answers with memory, only with the clack of wooden tolly beads. Taro returns that afternoon with a different face. He brings no coin. His net hangs empty and his shoulders are narrower for hunger. He stands at the water's edge and says, "Akio, I kept your name in my mouth and I swallowed it." I am sorry. I ask him plainly, "Why did you not speak to the Lord?" He looks at his hands. "Because I told you true before. We have no power." They paid hands to silent speech. "I could not buy you back." Taro's refusal is a second small betrayal that piles on Otsu's earlier transaction. I try to make the water itself an ally. I press my ear to the slats and listen to the wood creak and the river shift. I time the tides by watching the damp reach up the posts and leave a line on the hemp. The watch's stopped hand becomes a metronome of frustration. I beat against wood. Each beat is action. I twist, I pull, I wedge the jagged metal deeper into the ring. My throat tightens. A cough draws salt water up into my lungs. I choke and hold my breath until my lungs ache, because each breath is counted by those who watch. Otsu returns at night and throws a frayed bead into my lap. "Keep it," he says, his fingers wet from river mist. He moves faster than before, as if wanting to leave the guilt in the wood and not in his hands. I pick up the bead. It is worth nothing to them now, only a token. I feel the grain of the bead between thumb and forefinger and understand he expects me to accept the mock penance. I do not speak. I bind the bead back to my cord with a raw strip of hemp and press it against my chest. Cage and Otsu argue in full view the next morning. The tide is high and the crowd thicker. "Cut him loose," Cage says again, louder, and this time there is panic in his voice. "If we release him, the river may take him, but we will not feed the Lord's hunger for spectacle." Otsu snaps back. "You think the Lord will take our heads for mercy? You think mercy feeds a debt?" The argument breaks into three fast lines as they trade blame. Their voices are urgent and short. I test a new plan while they argue. I reach for the jagged edge of my watch and begin to saw at the rusted ring with method, timing my movements to the sway of the cage so my force lands where the metal is weakest. Each motion costs me. Blood runs into the hemp and into the water. Pain sharpens thought. My hands move with thought. Scrape, press, rotate. I count the strokes under my breath, quiet, patient and cold. The chain snaps with a noise like a struck gong. The cage shudders, and the crowd gasps in one wave. Cage stumbles and shouts. Otsu curses and steps back. The priestess Hannah drops her slate, and the stone of her tali rolls into the mud. For a sliver of air I taste hope and river foam together. That is the chapter's climax. The single brutal decision that the chain gives way and the cage begins to move. When the cage jerks free, it does not float gentle. The current grabs wood and tosses it. I am thrown against the slats until bruises bloom across my ribs. The river takes hold with teeth. It drills under the cage and it pulls. Guards reach for ropes, hands slipping on wet wood. Cage dives into the water and straps his arms around the chains to steady the cage.
Akio!
He shouts, voice ruined by exertion, hold on. His shout is a command and a promise tangled together. I make a decision in a single, cold motion. I will not cling to pity. I wedge my legs and brace my shoulders against the wet timber. I reach for the dented watch and push it through a gap so that the current might carry it out. My fingers tear and the watch slips. It clanks into the water with a small sound that feels like an admission. The river takes the watch, but not everything. As we drift, a line of villagers pulls on a rope from the downstream bank, trying to steer the cage toward a sandbar. Otsu shouts, cut the rope!
Kore!
The Lord will blame us if we lose him now. Cage answers with 3 fast words. I will not cut. They trade 3 more lines. The back and forth is sharp, each reply a short sentence that names the stakes. The guards' choices alter my motion on the water. Their voices shape where the cage will go. The cage hits a submerged rock and swings. The priestess Hannah throws herself at the slats and begins to beat on the wood with her fists, as if she can change Tali by violence. Her palm reddens. She cries out a single name, Mercy, and I hear it as a demand rather than a prayer. For a moment she looks like a woman who is beginning to regret counting human breaths the way she counted offerings. Then Taro appears upstream, wet to his knees, hands full of rope. He has returned with no coin this time, but with a willingness to risk the Lord's anger. He throws his end to the men on the bank and says, I will hold, Akio, I will hold this line. His voice is rough and small. I have seen him take fewer risks his whole life. This act alters my understanding of his earlier refusal. The twist. Taro's earlier avoidance was not moral cowardice but pragmatic fear. Now he chooses publicly to risk himself. The cage grinds over sand and stops. Men haul it toward a shallow bar and lift it up enough that I can breathe without water pushing into my mouth. Cage collapses onto his knees and vomits into the mud. Otsu stands and stares at the Lord's men, then sinks into quiet. The priestess Hannah sits and counts her fingers with slow precision. The crowd disperses, bets unresolved. The immediate threat resolves. I live through the high tide. The chapter resolves its mini-conflict and leaves a single trace of damage. Downstream, a lone fisherman, the one who had pulled the watch free, kneels to pick up the dented piece. He studies the cracked face and the initials on the back. He says nothing out loud, but his jaw works as he reads the mark that ties me to a pocket and an identity. He folds the broken prayer bead into his palm and looks back at the river where the cage drifted. That silent moment is a small, concrete echo. The river kept one trace. I am left with raw wrists, a shredded kimono, and a watchless empty pocket. I press the frayed prayer bead to the hollow above my sternum and count the breaths like a ledger. In, out, in, out. The betrayal that opened the chapter has shifted into a quiet calculus of survival. I have evidence now that the keepers timed my suffering, and that one man, Taro, risked himself enough to change a decision. The final paragraph ties to an action that moves forward. Cage digs a shallow trench and lays a prayer bead he found on the bank into the mud as an offering, then looks directly at me and says, "We will not let them carry you for spectacle again." His voice breaks once, and he reaches for my hand. I close my fingers around his wet palm and let the water finish its pulling, because a decision has been made aloud and it changes who will act next. The cage landed with a rasp and wood dust sprayed my face while Cage hammered the first peg through wet earth. Betrayal burned like grit under my tongue, and I counted the strokes of the mallet with my knuckles, wanting to mark every one so the day could not be erased. Cage did not look at me while he forced the rope. He kept his jaw tight and his shoulders set as if the act were finished before it began. A guard spat into the river and hummed a callous tune. The air smelled of iron and mud. I pressed my forehead against the slat to watch their hands. The first 5 sentences of the morning showed me what mattered. They meant to leave me where the tide could wear my name away. My hands were raw where the rope had burned. I tested the knots as Cage stepped back and measured the angle of the rope with a practiced eye. My throat closed around questions I could not speak. Who signed the paper that day? Who turned to the ledger in the magistrate's house? Who chose the water as witness? And those questions pushed me to do the only thing left. To witness and hold record. Cage's boot hit the mud once, twice. He tie it tight. No slack, his voice was flat, the way a man reciting hours on a bell might be flat. Cage, I said aloud, tasting the name like a warning. He glanced at me then, not softening. Cage, he replied, placing the mallet on his shoulder. The guards moved in silence and drove the remaining pegs. A disturbance came down the bank before the sun cleared the trees. Magistrate Ito arrived in clogs that left neat imprints in the mud. He walked as a man who expected obedience. Scribe Masaru followed with a folded board and ink. Magistrate Ito stopped in front of my cage and looked straight at my face as if he were reading a paper he had already decided on. Akio, Magistrate Ito. Loud enough for the guards to lower their heads. You are accused of hiding stolen grain and plotting against the rice houses. Confess and your death will be contained. Refuse and the river will take what you are. He did not ask. He put his hand on the cage, the heel of his palm pressing the wet wood and leaving a smear. Scribe Masaru scraped a blade across a slat and the sound made me claw at the rope. He carved a tally mark that bled sawdust. He then pressed a sheet of rice paper to the fresh wound and folded it as if making a seal. Masaru's hands were careful, almost tender, while he worked the tally. Masaru, I said, you mark me as if I were a beast. Masaru kept his head down. Masaru must record the law, he mumbled, scanning the board for approval. Hana was brought within sight as a warning. They shoved her toward the bank with a thin rope around her waist and lifted her briefly so that she looked down into my face. She had been pressed by guards before. Her clothes were wet and her hair hung in a clump. She did not speak. She shoved something into my palm as she passed, a scrap of wet paper folded 3 times. Her thumb brushed mine, and she mouthed a single breathless sign that meant betrayal. Then she was jerked away and made to walk in front of the magistrate. I opened the scrap with fingers that shook and found a single name and a number written in hurried kanji. The scrap smelled of river water and pine smoke. I folded it again and hid it in the seam of my hemp robe, near the amulet on my belt. Hana's eyes cut back over her shoulder once meeting mine. She did not wave. She only held my gaze for a heartbeat and then slit across the dirt with the guards. The act of passing the scrap felt like a base ceremony. It made me feel less alone and also more in danger. Time narrowed to pinpricks of sound. The hammer, the scraping blade, the slap of sandals. I counted the tide marks on the nearest slat with my finger. I had begun this recount to keep proof of myself. Each notch I made in my head was a small rebellion. The theft of my watch in the first day had already removed one piece of proof. I had named that loss aloud in the night. They took the watch, and Cage laughed in the dark. Now the tally on the cage would be another instrument to declare me nameless. Late morning brought a small, brutal ritual. Scribe Masaru took his ink and pressed it to the fresh tally, then rolled it across a blank page with a steady hand. Magistrate Ito watched without moving. This is done so the record is clear. Masaru nodded. The record will not forget. Their faces were calm. Their gestures made the erasure official. I put my cheek to the wet slat and tasted river mud. When they left, Cage stayed a pace behind and tilted his head. Akio, will you speak? I spat river water at his boot and said, Speak what? Lies with their seal. He frowned. Answer plainly. Will you confess? I did not. He stepped closer and the hemp rope hummed against my wrists as he adjusted it. Early afternoon, as shadow moved across the bank, Cage returned with the pretense of checking the knots. He crouched by the cage and reached through the slats. His fingers closed on the curve of the pocket watch at my waist. I had kept the dented piece small, a relic, a dented face with a cracked glass and the hands frozen at a meaningless hour. Cage did not hesitate. Cage, I said, my word's a brittle thing, keep it, take it, burn it. He did not answer. He pulled the watch free and held it up to the light. He then struck the glass with the edge of his knife until the face spider webbed and the glass fell away. I lunged for the straps and he slapped my hand with the flat of his palm and pushed it back. The action was quick and public. 2 guards stepped closer to make the act official. The theft of the watch changed the scale of the day. It made my earlier losses clear. a theft not of an object only, but of measurement of memory. Without the watch I could not name the hours as ID meant to. I clasped my teeth and pressed my forehead to the slat to shield the motion of my hands as I tried to make myself smaller so the guards might not take the amulet. Late afternoon came with a courier step. Magistrate Ito returned alone this time with a folded paper bearing a red seal. He held it out where I could see the stamp Accio, he said, frustration bracing his voice, confessed to the charges. Sign this and your death will be a private affair. Refuse and we make you an example. He spoke the words like a bargain recorded by law. I could see the ledger in his hand even though he kept it folded. He did not promise mercy. He promised concealment. I looked at Masaru's tally again and then at Ito. You trade my words for less spectacle. I said, is that your mercy? Ito's chin lifted. It is the magistrate's mercy. He answered, sign Accio. Sign and the matter is handled. Refuse and you will rot by the tide, and no one will remember your name except in whispers. His gaze made the bank seem thin. I hesitated because the choice was not only mine. If I signed, the confession would be copied and spread. My name would be inked into the records with my own hand, and those who had wronged me would get the quiet of an approved death. If I refused, I kept the right to be angry and to tell what they had done, but it would cost me more than the public eye. Betrayal had sharpened me into a recorder. It tugged at my fingers to refuse. I closed my eyes, breathed, and did the smallest thing I could do to protest. I spat onto the paper as it hovered in the magistrate's hand. Magistrate's mouth tightened. Do not make me force it, he said. Scribe Masaru pushed the paper toward me, and Cage leaned down to tighten my ropes with an extra twist. The tide turned as dusk reached the bank. A sudden swell struck the cage, and the wood bucked under the pressure. Water smashed through the slats like a thrown body. I rammed my shoulder into the wood to create a gap and shouted, "No!" The cry came out as a single, sharp thing. Cage snarled and lashed my wrists tighter with fresh rope. "Sign!" Magistrate Ito barked. He stood with the folded paper raised as if it were a weapon. Sign now. The air smelled of wet rope and the iron tang of the river when it churned. I had a single, violent moment in which every choice narrowed. My palms burned where the rope bit. The wound on my jaw pulsed where a slat had sliced it earlier. The tide punched again and water poured across the floor of the cage. I pushed my shoulder raw against the slats and tried to wedge my fingers into the gap I had made. I could feel the river tugging at the hem of my kimono. "Accio!" Cage barked in quick, clipped tones. Sign it. Sign and live without disgrace. Cage's words were businesslike, but his hands moved fast and without mercy. I pulled my hands away from the gap and met Ito's eyes as the magistrate stepped forward. "No," I said simply, "I will not sign what you write." My voice was low and the utterance cost me breath. The magistrate's face hardened. "Then you are already judged." The guards advanced and lashed my wrists tighter until the hemp cut grooves into the skin. The tide surged higher and water slammed against my ribs. I could taste salt and old rice. The cage pitched and something small and hard struck my knee from the inside as the boards shifted. The world outside narrowed to the sound of wood creaking and the magistrate's pen scratching as he finalized a notation on his ledger. When night came, the tide receded a fraction and left the cage sitting lower in a bed of cold muck. I found my prayer beads missing from the knot at my belt. My fingers, numb and clumsy, reached the seam where Hana's scrap lay. The paper was damp but intact, the number and name still readable. I slid it under the amulet and tightened the rope around my waist, tucking the proof into the fabric where the guards might not find it at a glance. Alone inside the cage, I counted the breaths of the bank. The scribe folding his ledger, the magistrate's sandals leaving prints, Cage's boots scuffing as he checked the pegs. At one point I heard Masaru's voice call out a notation, and the ink hit paper with a solemn whisper. The sound made the night sharper. At late night, a silent scribe copied a new notation into the ledger, and the magistrate signaled the guards to prepare the cage for longer submersion. I heard the command in the scrape of a sandal. They did not speak my name. They used a number. Scribe Masaru thumbed a fresh page and wrote the date, the tally mark, and a notation that signaled extended custody. The ink dried with the slow hiss of breath. I remembered the first day when the wooden frame collided with the river and my forehead slammed against the slats. That memory lived in the skin of my brow, the bruise, the salt, the wet hair sticking to my scalp. So I pressed the scarred area, and the physical recall steadied me for a moment. The memory proved true. The men had pushed the cage into the water then, and they had not returned to free me. This verification of fact hardened my refusal to sign. The night offered small resistances. I unrolled the damp scrap and traced the kanji with my fingertip until my fingertip ached. I spoke the name from the scrap under my breath, saying it aloud so that the sound could not be taken. Takamori. Saying the name felt like an act of property. It kept the person from being swallowed by their ledger. The spoken name performed the same job as a notched tally in my mind. Sometime before dawn I felt the bank's plan settle into place. There was a different rhythm in the footsteps on the shore, and a heavier presence when the magistrate's men tested the pegs again. The last thing I saw before drifting into a fitful, shallow sleep was Cage's back disappearing into the mist. And in that outline I registered how small the men looked when they canted their heads away to avoid seeing me wholly. Through the chapter my mood moved. Betrayal pushed me to keep record. Suspicion made me test knots and hide scraps. Anger made me spat on the magistrate's paper. Fear tightened my jaw when Cage tightened the rope. Defiance made me refuse to sign. Each shift showed in a movement or a small noise. A slammed palm, a held breath, a sudden silence. The actions carried the changes, not labels alone. The middle of the day had a twist I had not expected. Hana's scrap bore the name of a guard I had seen trading rice on a back road months before. The name linked a man in uniform to a warehouse ledger I knew from whispers. The discovery made my situation worse and more useful. If I died, the scrap could show the magistrate's collusion. If I lived, I had a bargaining tool. I tucked that discovery back into my robe and felt the paper fold against the amulet. The knowledge altered how I met the magistrate's bargain. The scrap made the magistrate less powerful and more like a man who feared exposure. Arguments happened in sharp bursts. Ito, sign and we close this, I said. Sign and you close me out of history. Ito's lip curled. You want to make a spectacle. He asked Magistrate Ito, you already made this a spectacle, I said. Cage interjected, enough. Decide they moved in short, quick lines of insistence, and I answered with equal short bursts. The exchange lasted only minutes, but the economy of words carried weight. At the climax, the tide decided as though it had been waiting for a command. Water rammed the slats and wood groaned. I shoved my shoulder and offered my voice. Cage lashed the rope. It had declared me judged. The guards prepared for my submission and met instead with my refusal. That refusal was not a performance. It was a choice made where my hands still had feeling and my voice could still form a word. After the tide smashed in and the men left, I counted the losses. The prayer beads were gone, my watch shattered, my name marked, but the scrap Hannah had given me remained. I folded it into the cloth and pressed it flat against my chest. The scrap was now the only document that tied a living man on the shore to the crimes they accused me of. It was both proof and a promise. The final act of the night came without fanfare. Scribe Masaru thumbed his pen and wrote a new notation into the ledger, extended custody, he muttered so no one else could hear. Then closed the book and handed it to Magistrate Ito. Ito set the ledger down and nodded to Cage. The guards moved to the pegs and pushed them deeper into the mud. I felt each peg settle as if I could measure the distance of my future by the depth of iron in the bank. The chapter closed with a small, decisive motion. A peg driven home, the ledger closed, and the guards turning away. My hands were numb. I pressed the palm of my right hand hard against the wet slat and felt the swell of my pulse. I will count the tides tonight and every night to come. I will press the scrap to my chest and say Takamori's name until the syllables outlast the mud. The shafts of the peg dug into the bank and the rope hummed low as Cage walked off. The magistrate's sandals left the last neat prints. The ledger sat shut on the table, a new notation inside that promised deeper water. The men left me where the river can decide what is witness and what is erasure. My mouth tasted of salt and grit. I pressed my forehead to the slat and listened to water retreating, then to men moving away. The final sound before sleep was the clip of a sandal sink in mud and the distant, casual step of Magistrate Ito. The night closed over the bank, and I kept the scrap hidden and the name alive. They shoved the cage another arm's length into the shallows, and I felt rope pull the breath out of my chest before I could speak. Betrayal burned in my throat in a way I could name. Cage planted his boot on the wet plank and hammered a peg while he watched the magistrate step aside. Stand still, Akio, Cage. The sound was a flat order, not a question. The river came in against the wood with a wet smack, and I counted the swell with my fingers the way I always had. 1, 2. So the day would not swallow itself. The problem was simple now. If the tide rose before anyone stopped them, the town would erase me in plain sight and call it justice. I am Akio. I do not give my name as a flourish. I give it because names settle in mouths like small stones, and I wanted one to sink if everything else was emptied. I remembered the first shove, the day the frame collided with the river, and my forehead struck the slats hard enough to split my lip, day one, and how salt and mud had braided with the taste of betrayal when Cage pushed and did not look back. I remember day two when the cage rasped to the bank and a mallet bit through wet soil, when Cage pounded the first peg and left grit under my tongue the way someone hides a small, bitter seed in food. Those two incidents taught me how quickly faces harden when a group decides an erasure is cheaper than a trial. Magistrate Oda stood at the bank with a sealed writ in his hand and a face that pretended to carry duty. He read the title aloud with his palm on the paper, but his voice carried no mercy. By order, he said, "This is a sentence of exposure." There is no delay. He sounded like a man reading from a ledger, not a man speaking to another human. The crowd shifted. Someone laughed to distract themselves. Priestess Hannah pushed from the edge of the spectators and waded in, bare knees churning muddy water. "There will be a final rite," she said. Her voice did what the writ could not. It interrupted the official choreography. Hope rose in me at her step into the current. That was the first shift. Betrayal to hope. Hannah had come before on other days to chant over nets and boats. She knew names. She pressed a palm to the cage slat and then produced a token of woven cord and lacquered wood that had belonged to my mother. "Akio," she said quietly. And she said my name like she was remembering a debt, not uttering a ritual formula. Cage spat and walked a step closer. "She has no standing," he said. "Keep back, priestess." The magistrate did not move to stop him. The second external event arrived as a boatman pulled up with another sealed writ and a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. He slung the bundle on the bank like an inconvenient thing and said, "This came from the upstream office. New orders." Magistrate Oda's face rearranged itself. He opened the second writ with fingers that trembled the way someone lifts the lid from a jar that smells wrong. "This says the sentence covers more than theft," he muttered. He tried to fold the paper away, but the river had ears. A boy near the bank cupped his hands and read aloud the words meant to be hidden. The new writ changed the shape of the punishment. It made erasure look like a cover-up. Now doubt moved through the officials, hope to doubt. Cage looked at Oda, and then at the writ and then at me. The junior guard, a lean man whose hair stuck to his forehead, surprised everyone by stepping forward and saying, "What are we hiding, magistrate?" His voice cut the rehearsed calm and forced an argument out into daylight. "We do our duty. Oda, we follow the order." He spoke cadence as if repeating a prayer. "Stand down." The junior guard shook his head. "This is a writ to bury a witness, not to punish a crime. Akio did not steal a boat. Someone else did. We saw it on the bank 3 nights ago." The boatman spat. His teeth glinted brown. "I brought the writ. I do not read it for men like me, but I saw the seal." Priestess Hannah pushed the oiled bundle toward the magistrate and said, "Open it." "Let the river not be the only witness." The junior guard kept speaking, each line a ripple that loosened the grip of the official script. 3 men argued. 3 more shoved at their certainty. Cage barked, "Enough. Tie him tighter." If the writ says exposure, we do exposure. He reached and tightened a knot around my wrists with an efficiency that smelled of practice. The rope bit into my skin and left thin raw lines like train tracks. I pressed my forehead to the wet slat and counted the next rise. The third external event in as many paragraphs. The knot creaked and shifted, and the world narrowed to the smell of wet hemp and the sound of Magistrate Otis' breath. I slipped a finger under the slat and felt for the torn prayer bead that hung at my belt. I had rubbed the beads raw on day 2 while the mallet fell and left salt in my mouth. The bead's broken thread had one last loop. I pushed my hand through the slat and hooked the bead. It came free with a small stubborn sound. Akio, Priestess Hannah, you still hold something of home. I tried to lift the bead high enough to show it, to force a pause. Cage struck the slat with the flats of his palm and said, "Do not make me take it, Akio. We will do this properly." His breath steamed in the cold. I held the bead like a bargaining chip. This was an action. It was not a prayer. I pushed the bead through the slat toward Cage and said, "Cage, if you untie one knot for me, I will give you this and the watch." My voice was rough from salt and lack of rest. Cage's jaw worked. "You think you can buy mercy?" He snapped. "You think words will change the writ?" He did not unfasten a knot. The junior guard stepped in, voice low. "Cage, listen. If we do this now, the writ says nothing about the token. Let her speak. Let the town see." Cage's face flushed with something like irritation and then calculation. He looked at Oda. Oda looked at the boatman. The boatman looked at the river. The bargain failed on its own terms when the second writ came into the open. It named a payoff, a shipment that never reached shore, and a list of men who would be spared if the witness was erased. The priestess unwrapped the oiled cloth and revealed a ledger soaked at the corner with damp ink. She held it up and said, "This ledger matches the names on the boats. Magistrate Oda, you signed this under another hand." I heard the crowd take breath, like people who watch a horse stumble but hope it rights itself. The fourth external event. The ledger showed a face of the town's economy that the magistrate had been covering. Oda's mouth tightened. He reached for the pages and his hand shook as if he feared they would burn him. "This is false," he said. "These claims are rumor and jealous men." His voice tried to anchor the argument, but the junior guard stepped close and said, "Where is your signature, Magistrate?" 3 guards, including Cage, moved toward the priestess. Cage grabbed the ledger with a hand meant to hide it and said, "You will stop this. This is not for the river to decide." Priestess Hannah pressed her palm flat against the ledger like she would press a wound and said, "The river already decides what men try to bury. It brings back what is loose." She fixed her eyes on Cage. Short, exact syllables. "You will not take that ledger." The action tightened another thread. Hope swelled again, doubt shifting to defiance. Then the tide surged. The sky that had been flat with cloud deepened, wind pulled at the edges of robes, and water came in faster than any of us counted. The fifth external event arrived as stormlight bent across the river and slammed the cage with a hard, shaking bump. Rope creaked. A peg tore free with a sound like a branch snapping. The world disintegrated into small, practical noises, wood grinding, splintering, a sharp intake of breath from the magistrate. The climax came in the next breath. The cage swung, water filling the bottom and rising, and someone yelled, "Hold the line!" Cage shouted and dove to the slat to wrest a rope. The junior guard slipped on mud and landed with a curse on his chin, his hands scrabbling at the pegs. Priestess Hannah pushed herself forward, chest heaving, and grabbed for the ledger but could not find purchase on the wet cloth. I felt water sip up the hem of my kimono and my lungs tighten with the sound of it. I shoved my hand through the slat and found the pocket watch. Its crack was a spiderweb of glass, and the hands were still. Action compressed into a handful of sharp motions. Cage lunged, the junior guard grabbed his sleeve, Magistrate Oda stepped back and dropped the writ. The boatman yanked his skiff in and pushed with a pole. I had one choice that did not involve bargaining with men who had already chosen to hide a ledger. I reached for the ledger when Cage's arm swung away, and I felt the water flood the frame fast enough to blur the edges of thought. I held the ledger with both hands and pushed it out through the slats toward Priestess Hannah.
Take it!
I barked, the sound cutting through the crash. Hannah snagged the corner of the ledger with 2 fingers and held it as the cage pitched. Cage's palm closed on my wrist, and the rope flashed against my skin. He tried to haul my hand back. "You will drown," he said. "Let it be done." His words were thick with the exercise of will. That was the second major emotional shift, defiance to fear. My fingers clenched the ledger. The rope burned. The tide took the frame, and my chest filled with cold water where air should be. I could not think of honor or future. There was only the ledger, the bead in Hannah's palm, the cracked watch ticking somewhere close to my ribs. I kicked my legs and felt the cage heel. My teeth grazed the slat. Salt stung where the skin split. People shouted. The magistrate's voice tried to regain control. "Pull him free!" But the knots strained and a peg came loose, and the cage swung out into deeper channel, where the water rammed the wood with blunt force. I made a decision that is a kind you can measure by the single thing you hand away. I pushed my face into the current to see if sound would still leave the mouth, and even with water in my lungs I managed a line. Read it. Read my name in it. Hannah's fingers closed, wet and white, on the ledger. She opened it with care as if opening a sealed wound and saw my name inked in cramped characters on a margin where bribe amounts had been tallied. She looked toward the magistrate and then at the crowd. "Akio's name is here," she said. The ledger did not speak beyond the ink, but people read the numbers and the seals, and the paper's wet corners, and then they looked at the magistrate. A short, savage exchange followed on the bank, 3 to 5 lines of quick argument where voices collided and names were thrown. "Oda."
You signed this.
The junior guard said. "Oda, answer." Magistrate Oda's hands were empty. He could not find the words to push the ledger back into acceptable shapes. Cage tried to pull me closer to the bank, but the current had already taken the cage's angle, and a rope snapped with a sound like a snapped bone. The boatman's pole struck the water and he pushed, shouting for men to help, and a dozen hands reached out. The crowd's mood folded in on itself, and a woman screamed that the magistrate had traded away the town for cargo and coin. The ledger's facts forced the argument into law and then into shame. The town script had been appended, the 6th external event. The ledger's evidence moved the political line from private contract to public scandal. I felt the surge take the wood under me and a single plank give. My left shoulder banged the slat and a bright light of pain shot down my arm. Cage cursed and grabbed the rope with both hands. His face was close and he said, "Akio, let go. It will be kinder." I tasted blood in the corners of my mouth and thought of the first peg hammered on day 2 and how I had counted mallet strikes to make the day accountable. I thought of the pocket watch in my pocket and the ritual beads broken at my waist and how each small object had been the only proof that I had been here. Priestess Hannah called out to the crowd,
Read the ledger! Read what he wrote!
She read aloud the line with my name and the amount next to it. The crowd murmured and then began to shout. The junior guard stepped over the magistrate and grabbed Oda's sleeve. "You led us into this," he said, voice hard and even. "You signed the names." Cage looked at Oda and then looked at the ledger in Hannah's hand. His shoulders slumped for the briefest moment. The man who had pushed me from the first day had to decide whether his loyalty was to a writ or to the town. The turning point came when Cage released his hold on my wrist and instead moved to block the magistrate. He did not untee me. He wrapped his fingers around the rope and cut one binding with a knife that glinted dully in the wind. He did not meet my eyes. "I will not hand him to you to hide the ledger," he said to Oda. The words were small, but they redirected the scene. The 7th external event. A guard's hesitation split the official line and created a path for exposure. I could have used the sudden slack to crawl out and demand justice with a voice that was not drowned by water. Instead, I did the only thing I had left that would not vanish with a rising tide. I pushed the pocket watch out through a slat and let it drop into the current with the ledger between my hands toward Hannah. The watch twirled and then stopped flashing and sank a fraction before the flow took it. Hannah cupped the ledger to her chest as if holding a child and stepped back to the bank while the crowd closed around her. The final surge came with thunder and a roar. The cage flipped and water closed over my face. I remember the slam of wet wood and the small, private fear of not being able to move my hands. My lungs burned and I could not hear people's names properly. Voices were muffled as though heard through cloth. I felt something small and hard, Cage's fingers, slip from my wrist. I felt the last line of the rope slide past my palm, as if the knot had finally given up. Then everything in my lungs was the river, and one last thought was the ledger pressed against a woman's chest while she shouted my name, so that the sound broke into pieces and scattered across the bank. I surfaced later in pieces of memory that arrived like physical knocks. The boatman saw propelling me onto a muddy shelf, hands pulling me out, Priestess Hannah slapping my cheeks to bring air back. I cuffed a bucket of water and tasted ink and iron. My clothes clung to me in heavy, mucky sheets. Magistrate Oda sat with his head on his hands. Cage rested his weight on a peg and did not meet the look of the junior guard. The boatman spat into the river and said nothing. The ledger lay on the bank like evidence dressed in dark wetness. I do not claim a grand resolution. Men answered to what the town would allow. The magistrate was taken by a small committee to the town hall and his seal was confiscated. Cage was held for questioning. The junior guard demanded it and the crowd supported him. The ledger's pages were copied, read in a tense cluster of voices, and the names on the lists could no longer be businesses that hid while others paid the cost. Priestess Hannah tied my broken prayer bead to the ledger and said, "This will travel where rulers refuse to go." Her voice was low and exact. We all moved as if a weight had been lifted, and also as if something else had been lost. I had wanted to survive simply to tell what the ledger said, and to make sure the people who hid in law had to face daylight. I had also wanted to leave a mark of my life shallower than erasure. The ledger did both. It exposed the names. It named me in the margin of commerce. The town did not immediately become honest. Men do not change in a day. But the ledger traveled to the river shrine, where a scribe copied it in black ink and a dozen witnesses signed their names with shaking fingers. That was evidence given a body. Cage came to stand near me later, sleeves rolled, hands raw from rope. He did not speak for a long moment. Then he touched the scarred ridge along my jaw, the place where the first day had split me, and said, "I did what I was told, Accio." The line was not an apology. It was an inventory. I answered only, "You did not finish it." The words were a measure, not a demand. Priestess Hannah walked with the ledger in her hands down the main street, and every merchant and fisherman watched her. She did not call them to shame. She simply let them read their names. A woman who had once sold fish to Magistrate Oda spat and said, "They took the nets and kept the receipts." The ledger rebuilt the town's conversation into facts. In the end, the smallest thing refused to sink. The bead of a prayer tied to an accounting. It moved from my belt to Hannah's fingers and then into the town archives, where writers copied the numbers into bound books so the ledger would not be a secret again. The boatman who had delivered the second writ was arrested for forging a seal. Magistrate Oda was removed from office and his house searched. Cage was reprimanded and then quietly reassigned. He kept a scar on his hand where the rope had burned. I cannot wrap this in a moral. The river took my breath, and it also forced a ledger into the light. People will argue whether that ledger cost lives or saved them. For me, the ledger did what I wanted. It named me with ink that would not vanish under tide. When I closed my eyes later that night in a room that smelled of oil and tea, my hands still trembled from holding the wood of the slat. Priestess Hannah came and set the ledger on the floor between us and touched my knuckles the paper. "Cool palm, you kept a record with your body," she said. "If anything shifts inside me now, it will be concrete. The scar along my jaw, the place where the rope nicked my wrists, the way the watch no longer keeps time. My decisions were measured in the small objects I could hand to others, a bead, a watch, a ledger. The ledger forced choices out of men who had thought themselves safe behind official ink. The junior guard will keep his position and will tell the townspeople he spoke up. Some will praise him. Others will say it was only good luck. Cage will carry his choice like a heavy stone. The tide smoothed the riverbank where the cage had been. Later, the single item that floated free was the pocket watch. It washed up near the shrine with its cracked face open to no hour. A child picked it up and showed it to Priestess Hannah, who tied a scrap of red cloth to its chain and tucked it into her shrine box. The ledger sat on the scribe's table with a weight that made it hard to move. The names inside would travel by ink and by mouth until men could not claim ignorance. The last paragraph is a beat. Priestess Hannah stood at the shrine at dusk and read aloud the ledger's line with my name present. The crowd leaning in as if listening could change the record. And when she finished, she set the ledger beneath a stone and walked away with the broken watch in her palm, the bead tucked into the ledger's corner. While Magistrate Oda was led off under guard and Cage watched the river as if searching for the shape of his own choice.